we letting the cleaning staff dine with us now?" Her voice sliced through the warm afternoon like ice dropped in a hot tea. Shocking, sharp, and far too loud to ignore. The hush fell instantly. Heads turned, some with curiosity, others with pity. Gloria Samuels stood motionless at the marble steps of the country club, her gloved hand clutching her purse tighter, as if the insult might spill something inside her. A young man across the patio stiffened, his champagne flute frozen halfway to his lips. He saw everything, the woman in uniform blocking Gloria's path, the tightness around his mother's eyes, and now this. Victoria Hathaway's voice, ringing out like gospel in a place where tradition always trumped dignity. A quiet chuckle escaped one of the board members. Another man looked down at his shoes, embarrassed but unwilling to interfere. Gloria didn't speak. Her chin lifted slightly. Her feet didn't move, but her fingers gripped the leather strap like she was holding herself up with it. Victoria turned and walked off, pearls swaying with every step, already done with the moment, as if it hadn't happened. But it had, and what she didn't know, what no one there knew, was that the man now calmly lowering his glass and walking toward the entrance wasn't just another guest. He was the CEO about to sign a $900 million deal. And Gloria, she wasn't staff. She was his mother. The valet had barely reached for the handle when Gloria Samuels stepped out of the black Lincoln Navigator with the quiet elegance of a woman who never needed applause to feel dignified. She held her purse in both hands, the same way she had for decades. One hand gently wrapped around the other, a gesture that looked simple but held the weight of restraint. Her white hat, broad-brimmed with a pale ribbon, cast a soft shadow over her face, a Sunday hat that once turned heads at church, now at a place under the crisp sky of Greenwich. Derek had told her to keep it casual. "Just a small toast, Ma. Nothing big," he'd said, but she'd worn her best anyway. She wasn't here for appearances. She was here because her son asked, because this day was about him, and he was everything she'd ever worked for. As she approached the grand stone steps of the country club, she thought of him as a boy, working late shifts at the corner store, fixing his tie in the reflection of the toaster oven window before school. She didn't care about Hathaway, or mergers, or champagne towers. She came because her son was about to sign the deal of his life, and he wanted her there. But she hadn't even crossed the first step before the woman in uniform cut her off, posture rigid, voice clipped. Deliveries and staff used the rear entrance. There's no courtesy in the words, just policy delivered like a verdict. Gloria blinked once, processing. "I'm here for lunch with my son, Derek Samuels." Her tone was gentle, even rehearsed. She didn't raise her voice. She never had to, but the woman didn't budge. "If you part catering, the service entrance is on the left." It wasn't the first time someone had assumed. It wasn't even the 10th, but that didn't make it any easier. Across the lawn, Derek raised his glass. Mid-toast. The light caught his cufflinks. A flicker of pride crossed his face, until he saw the interaction, the stance, his mother's stillness, the uniformed woman's body blocking the sunlight, and something inside him shifted, just enough to quiet the celebration in his mind. Gloria had tried again, voice firmer. "You can check the list. My name is Gloria Samuels. My son is one of the owners." And before the woman could speak, Victoria Hathaway's voice arrived like a slap without a hand. "Well, I suppose they let anyone in these days." The laughter that followed wasn't loud, but it was enough. Enough to break something that had taken years to build, and only seconds to shatter. Victoria didn't stop walking, didn't wait for acknowledgement. She had delivered her line and moved on, leaving behind a silence far heavier than her pearls. Derek lowered his glass. His colleagues noticed. A few tried to cover the shift in atmosphere with soft murmurs or awkward laughter. Bradley Hathaway muttered that it was probably just a joke. But Derek didn't hear him. He was already walking. Not fast, not angry, just moving with purpose. Like a man who had stopped pretending everything was okay. Gloria stood her ground. She didn't cry. She didn't speak. She just waited until her son arrived and placed a hand on her shoulder. "You okay?" he asked. She nodded. "I don't want to make a fuss, baby." He gave her the look only a son who had watched his mother's sacrifice everything could give. "I know you don't, but I will." He turned toward the woman in uniform. "This is my mother. You just disrespected the most important person in this building." Her eyes widened. She tried to speak, but nothing came. Derek didn't wait for an apology. He didn't need one. He gently walked Gloria back to the SUV, opened the door for her himself, helped her in. She reached for his arm before he closed the door. "Don't ruin your moment over me." His voice was steady, but his eyes burned. "You are the moment." Then he shut the door and walked back toward the building, steps quiet but deliberate, like every marble tile beneath his shoes was carrying the weight of more than just a man. Inside, the pen waited, the contracts, the glassware and small talk, everything ready for a celebration that had been a year in the making. But the man walking up those steps wasn't here to celebrate anymore. Not in the way they expected, not after what he'd just seen, because some things are bigger than business. Some moments crack through the performance and show you who people really are. And for Derek Samuels, that moment had just arrived. Back inside the dining hall, the room looked like it had been frozen in time. Derek's seat at the head of the table sat untouched, the pen beside it gleaming under the filtered light. A thick stack of legal documents rested nearby, pages filled with strategy, alignment, and over a year of work. Waiters moved delicately between crystal glasses and folded napkins. Conversations buzzed low, cautious. The champagne tower sparkled near the windows, untouched. Everyone knew this was supposed to be a celebration, but something in the air had shifted. Derek entered with the same calmness he'd always carried, measured, poised. But for those who knew him well, something was missing. The smile, the spark in his eyes, the warmth. Instead, his expression held something deeper. Not anger, not sadness, just resolve. Preston Ward, Hathaway's general counsel, noticed it instantly. "Everything all right?" he asked, tone steady but eyes darting, like he was already bracing for impact. Derek didn't answer right away. He scanned a room. Board members, legal teams, investment partners, and, finally, Victoria Hathaway. She was half-turned in her seat, sipping wine, looking every bit as composed as always. She didn't glance his way. Why would she? In her mind, the deal was done. The numbers had spoken. The champagne had been chilled. Nothing else mattered. Derek walked toward his chair, but didn't sit. Instead, he placed both hands on the backrest, letting the silence settle before speaking. "I want to say something." A few heads turned. The room didn't hush. It froze. Forks paused mid-air. Pens stopped scribbling. Even the servers halted just outside the doorway. He looked around, meeting eyes one by one, making sure they were all listening. "You all know how much this deal meant. Not just for our companies, but for the markets. For the future of tech infrastructure in this country. This merger was supposed to change everything." He paused. No one dared interrupt. "But I'm not signing it." A full second passed. Then the noise began. Soft gasps, confused murmurs, a rustle of movement. Someone whispered, "What did he just say?" Victoria finally turned her head. Not quickly, not dramatically, but precisely. Her brows lifted slightly, just enough to show offense. "Excuse me," she asked, her tone teetering between confusion and contempt. Derek nodded slowly. "Excuse you indeed." Preston leaned forward, voice careful. "Derek, if there's something we need to revisit in the agreement, we can go back to the table. No need to make a statement like this." Derek let out a quiet breath, then pulled out a chair. Not the signing seat, but the one furthest from the contracts. And he sat. "No," he said simply. "There is no more table." Victoria scoffed, her laugh light but sharp. She leaned in slightly, her pearls catching the light. "Let's not overreact to a simple misunderstanding. I didn't recognize the woman, that's all." Derek blinked once, slow and deliberate. "That woman is my mother." She straightened in her chair. "I'm aware of that now. But surely, no," he said again, this time cutting her off with a softness that carried more weight than shouting ever could. "You knew what you were doing. You said what you meant." Preston looked visibly uncomfortable now. "Derek, both companies have invested millions into this deal. If this is about a personal misunderstanding, it's not a misunderstanding," Derek replied. "It's a culture. It's a tone that's so ingrained you don't even hear yourselves anymore." Victoria's face tightened, but she said nothing. "You think I built this company from a corner office?" he continued. "I loaded trucks. I drove routes at 3 a.m. I ran payroll from a folding table when we couldn't afford an accountant. And I watched my mother take the bus across town to clean houses so I could keep her lights on. So she shows up here wearing her best and proud as hell. And you humiliate her in front of everyone. You humiliate me." No one moved. No one spoke. The silence was heavy, the kind that makes people glance at each other, wondering who will break it first. But Derek didn't wait. He stood again, slowly, with calm precision. "There are deals you lose sleep over not signing," he said. "This isn't one of them." With that, he turned and walked out. No folder in hand, no handshake, no second glance. Just the sound of his footsteps on polished floors, and the weight of every unspoken truth echoing behind him. It took a few seconds for the room to exhale, but even as they did, no one could shake the feeling that something irreversible had just occurred. Victoria sat still, her smile stiff now, her fingers curling around the stem of her glass. The pan that was meant to change the trajectory of two companies lay untouched on the table, beneath a spotlight that now felt far too bright, because in that moment, everyone realized the story had already shifted, and it would no longer be about a merger. It would be about the man who walked away. By the next morning, silence wasn't an option for anyone. The story had slipped out, first as a whisper, then a spark, and finally a full-blown fire racing through headlines. It started with a podcast. A business analyst from Philadelphia, who had been seated 2 tables down at the country club, dropped a single sentence into an interview. Black CEO walks out of $900 million deal after mother insulted by white billionaire family. That alone was enough. By noon, TechPulse had it. By 1, it was trending on X. By 3, Forbes, Business Today, and every finance blog on the map were dissecting the moment frame by frame. The deal didn't just fall apart. It collapsed for a reason that cut across money and power and went straight to pride, integrity, family. Cable news anchors debated the move. Was it bold? Was it reckless? Was it necessary? Opinion split. But one thing was undeniable. Derek Samuels had walked out of a billion-dollar room, not because of the terms of a deal, but because someone disrespected his mother, and that struck a nerve the markets couldn't hedge. That afternoon, a reporter caught Derek entering his downtown Newark office. He wore no sunglasses, carried no entourage, just a coffee in one hand and a quiet nod to the front desk receptionist. A voice called out, "Was the Hathaway comment the reason you canceled?" Another asked, "Do you regret walking away from $900 million? He didn't pause, didn't turn. Not yet. Inside the building, his team was already drowning in messages, calls, emails, press requests. Some investors were panicking, others were furious, but a surprising number were simply proud. Warehouse workers sent in voicemails. Public school teachers, nurses, retired military vets, they all said the same thing. "Thank you for not letting that slide." For once, it felt like someone had drawn a line. That evening, Derek called a press conference. No polished backdrop, no glossy pamphlets, just a room built for 10 people that now held 20 reporters, crammed elbow to elbow around a folding table and a single mic. He walked in without notes. Looked tired, yes, but steady, grounded. "I didn't cancel the deal because of money," he began. "I canceled it because the second you allow disrespect into the room, it spreads. I wasn't raised that way, and I'm not building a future on top of silence." The flashbulbs didn't explode. The room didn't erupt. It just listened. A reporter from CNBC asked bluntly, "Did Victoria Hathaway make the comment directly?" Derek nodded. "Yes. Loud enough for others nearby to hear. Loud enough for my mother to feel it." Another reporter challenged him. "Some might say that's not a reason to walk away from a company-defining deal." Derek didn't blink. "Depends on what kind of company you're trying to define." He didn't stay long. He didn't need to. "Respect isn't negotiable," he said, just before stepping away from the podium. "And if we start trading that for contracts, then we've already lost." He left to the sound of pens scribbling and murmurs rising. That single line, "Respect isn't negotiable," spread like a spark on dry leaves. It was quoted in editorials, turned into TikTok soundbites, plastered across slides in corporate DI meetings. But Derek hadn't planned it. He hadn't crafted a slogan. He'd simply said what he believed, and that, somehow, was more powerful than the most calculated campaign. That night, clips of his speech flooded social media. On X, one former Hathaway employee posted about being forced to use the service elevator during Gala. A Latina caterer recalled being told to remove her apron before entering the main lobby for an event setup. A black accountant shared how he was mistaken for a delivery man in the Hathaway office more than once. The thread racked up thousands of reposts in hours. What started as Derek's stand had cracked something open. Suddenly, people weren't just whispering about the way old money behaved behind closed doors. They were saying it out loud. And Victoria Hathaway's name was on everyone's lips. Not for business, but for bias. Behind the scenes, the Hathaway group scrambled. PR firms were called. Legal teams huddled. Victoria's oldest son, Clinton, who'd been mostly silent throughout the merger process, finally spoke during a closed-door meeting. "Do we need to issue an apology?" he asked. Victoria, seated at the head of the family's long mahogany table, barely looked up. "I don't apologize to people who overreact." Clinton flinched. "You insulted the man's mother." In public, during the signing, someone else at the table added, "What did you think was going to happen?" But Victoria remained unmoved. "We've said worse to each other in this very room, and no one's canceled a billion-dollar deal over it." Her tone was clipped, dismissive, like the world was simply being too sensitive. Clinton tried again. "Our stock is slipping. Brand analysts are warning about reputation loss. Even our PR team is hesitating." But she waved it off. "People forget. It's a fad. A week from now, something else will trend." Clinton stared at her, as if seeing her for the first time. "They won't forget this," he said, "because for once, someone with power didn't swallow it." He walked, and just like that, the weight of it finally started to sink in, maybe not for Victoria, but for everyone else in that room. Eventually, the Hathaways released a statement. Cold, vague, full of legal polish, and not an ounce of real remorse. The Hathaway Group regrets the recent miscommunication that led to the premature end of the merger. "We continue to uphold values of inclusion and mutual respect." It didn't help. If anything, it poured gas on the fire. Commentators ripped it apart. Users reposted it with eye-roll emojis, sarcastic hashtags, and screenshots of Victoria's comment from a luncheon. Derek didn't respond. Not in interviews, not on social media, but his silence spoke volumes. Instead, he got back to work. He met with his team. He checked in with suppliers. He spent Sunday with his mother, bringing her banana pudding from the bakery she liked in Trenton. The media wanted more drama, but what they got was a man moving forward. Meanwhile, the story kept growing. Not because Derek pushed it, but because people saw themselves in it, and they weren't letting go. Because for once, someone had walked away from money, and into something far bigger. Inside Derek's Newark headquarters, the noise from the outside world didn't exactly quiet down. It just changed tone. While the media turned him into a symbol, inside his own walls, the reality was more complicated. Symbols are heavy. They come with pressure, and Derek could feel it mounting. In the upstairs conference room, sunlight poured through glass walls that overlooked Market Street. Around the table sat the people who'd helped build the company, many from day one. They were loyal, but loyalty has layers. And today, not everyone looked aligned. Elliot Trammell, CFO, was the first to speak. We need to talk about long-term implications, not just headlines, not just this week. This decision, it wasn't small. Derek nodded once. He expected this. I know, Elliot continued. We had international infrastructure hinging on that merger. Port access, freight clearance, cross-border licenses. His voice was measured, but the tension underneath was real. Then Julian Ricks, COO, leaned forward. Hathaway's already moving. Their legal counsel is drafting breach claims. They're saying we walked away for personal reasons. Derek kept his tone steady. It wasn't personal. It was principle. Julian didn't flinch, and I respect that. But we're still in Series C. We're not backed by a sovereign fund. The board's going to panic. Derek didn't blink. Let them. The room fell quiet. No one was used to hearing that. Not from him. For a few seconds, the only sound was the faint hum of the HVAC. Then Nia Whitlow, head of marketing, broke the silence. She didn't raise her voice. She didn't have to. Derek, I support you. You know that. But you need to understand. You become more than CEO now. You're a headline, a symbol. People are calling you the man who walked away from generational wealth to defend his mother's dignity. That kind of mythology, it burns bright, but it also attracts fire. Elliot added, you're now the guy who said no to $1 billion because someone insulted his mom in public. Derek folded his arms, leaning slightly back. I said no to being owned. Nia nodded. I get that, but you have to get this. If you don't shape the story, someone else will, and they'll tell it wrong. Derek stood, walking to the glass wall. Outside, the city looked ordinary. Buses, honking, people walking with coffees and headphones, unaware they were part of a new chapter unfolding a few stories above. He watched a mother cross the street, holding her child's hand. His jaw tightened. I'm not going to teach people that power means swallowing everything. Not in this company. Not for a check. His voice was low, but it carried, and they all heard it. Julian leaned back in a chair, rubbing his temples. Okay, but what if this sinks us? What if the fallout isn't just media noise? What if we collapse because of this? Derek turned slowly, hands in his pockets. Then we rebuild, he said, but at least we don't rot from the inside. The room didn't erupt with applause. No one smiled, but something shifted. A beat of clarity. Nia looked at Elliot, and Elliot gave a slow nod. We'll hold, Elliot said. For now. Julian did nod. Not fully, but he didn't push back either. There was no dramatic consensus. No team chant, but there was a moment, a fragile understanding that sometimes leadership doesn't come with harmony. Sometimes it's choosing the storm anyway. Outside, the press was still circling. Inside, the company held its breath. And Derek knew this was only the first wave. There would be more calls, more pressure, more fear. But for now, the people who mattered most were still in the room, and they were still with him. But outside those walls, not everyone was ready to ride the storm with him, especially those who had quietly built their lives around the promise of the Hathaway deal. 2 days later, Derek's phone buzzed with a short message from Theron Ingram, his cousin, his co-founder, the man who'd sketched their first warehouse design with him on a napkin in a Jersey diner. The message was simple. We need to talk. Face to face. They met at that same diner in West Orange. Same booth. Same coffee mugs. But everything else had changed. Theron was already seated when Derek arrived. No greetings. No smiles. Just straight to it. Monroe Bank paused her credit line, Theron said. The one for West Coast scale-up. Derek sat down. I figured they might. Theron stared at him. You figured. His voice was quiet, but sharp. Derek, this wasn't just a handshake with old money. This was our jump. Our kids' futures. You made a decision for all of us. Derek's voice stayed calm. I wasn't going to build that future on my mother's humiliation. Theron's jaw tightened. Maybe that was her fight to pick. Not yours. Derek leaned in. She wasn't fighting. She was being stepped on. And with that, the air between them turned heavy, familial, fractured, and far from finished. Farron sat back in the booth, coffee untouched, fingers drumming the tabletop like he was holding back a storm. "You ever think maybe you were too close to it?" he asked. "Too emotional?" Derek's eyes didn't waver. "You ever think maybe too many people get used to swallowing it because someone always says we're being emotional?" Farron shook his head. "This isn't Trenton D. This is national, global. People are watching, and not all of them are rooting for us." Derek didn't move. "I'm not here to make everyone comfortable." Farron leaned in. "You didn't ask. You didn't call. You didn't even warn me. I found out from the same headline everyone else did." Derek exhaled, "Because I didn't want someone I love to talk me out of it." That landed. Farron's stare softened for a moment, but only just. "You ever think how close we were?" he said quietly. "How much work it took to get here. We weren't born into this. We built it with our backs and our blood. And I protected it." Derek cut in. "I protected what made it worth building in the first place." Farron's jaw tightened. He reached for his cup, but didn't sip. "You'd better hope this noble stand holds. Because if it doesn't," he didn't finish the sentence. He didn't have to. Derek already knew what was left hanging in the silence. Derek slid a 20 across the table and stood. "If it doesn't hold," he said, "I'll still sleep fine." Farron didn't reply, just watched him leave like he wasn't sure whether to follow or let him walk. Outside, the air was cold, the wind sharp against Derek's collar, but it wasn't the chill that unsettled him. It was the weight of realizing that standing up sometimes meant standing alone, and he hadn't even seen the next wave coming, because while the Hathaway family was reeling from the PR disaster, they were quietly loading another round. This time, not through press statements but legal angles. Power plays. Reputation warfare. The kind that hits quietly and cuts deep. Derek didn't know yet, but someone was already picking up the phone. A blocked number. A call placed from a burner line. A voice from the shadows. That evening, he was alone in his office, reviewing projections for a shipment corridor he was hoping to expand. The building was nearly empty, just the cleaning staff moving for the lower floors. He almost didn't answer when his phone buzzed. Blocked ID. He hovered a second, then picked up. "Mr. Samuels," the voice rasped, aged but clear. "I'm not calling for trouble. I'm calling because you need to know what they're preparing to do." Derek straightened in his chair. "Who is this?" The voice didn't hesitate. "Someone who worked with the Hathaways for 15 years. Legal acquisition team. I've seen what they do when someone embarrasses them in public." Derek's knuckles whitened on the edge of the desk. "Go on." "They're prepping a countersuit. Quiet, internal but aggressive. Digging into your early filings, your first funding rounds. They want to make you look unstable, volatile, like you brought politics into business and ruined shareholder value. Their goal is to bury your credibility, not just cancel the deal, but cancel you." Derek exhaled slowly, pressing his thumb into his temple. "Why are you telling me this?" "Because I've watched them do it before. Erase people, silence them. They destroy, then deny. You embarrass them, Mr. Samuels. And they don't lose quietly." The line clicked dead. No name, no callback number, just silence. Derek stared at the screen, the stillness in the room now thick with something colder than fear, certainty. He didn't panic, but he knew this wasn't going to stay about principle or headlines. It was about survival now, and they wouldn't stop at his name. They'd go for his team, his investors, even his mother, if they had to. The next morning, Derek called Nia. He laid it all out, every word from the voice on the phone. Nia didn't sound shocked, just ready. "Victoria doesn't lose quietly," she said. "She'll flip this on you, make it seem like you were the aggressor all along." "Let her try," Derek replied, but Nia was already moving faster. "No, we take the narrative back before she warps it. We remind people who you are before she tells them who you're not." Within 48 hours, a campaign was live. No logos, no glossy taglines, just people, real voices. Warehouse workers recording short clips. Partners talking about Derek's honesty during lean quarters. Former interns sharing how he mentored them without press or praise. But the one that hit hardest came from Gloria. In a grainy, one-take video, she sat in her living room, hands folded in her lap. "I didn't raise my son to be a businessman," she said. "I raised him to be a man who stands, even when standing means losing something." That line cracked the internet wide open. It was stitched, shared, turned into canvas prints and phone backgrounds. And slowly, the strategy Hathaway had been building, whispers, distortions, legal smoke, started to look exactly like what it was: bitterness dressed up as damage control. And people weren't buying it. Inside the Hathaway estate, the mood was anything but composed. The house, a symbol of generational power and perfection, now echoed with discomfort. The study's velvet chairs and polished mahogany table offered no comfort as Victoria Hathaway sat at the head, her fingers clasped, her face still. Her sons, Clinton, Bradley, and a handful of key advisors formed a tight circle around her. The doors were shut. The air was stiff. Bradley was scrolling through his phone nervously, glancing up every few seconds. Clinton paced the length of the rug, jaw tight. The only person who seemed remotely composed was Eleanor Wynne, the PR strategist brought in when the firm's own team started flailing. "We need to issue a statement," Eleanor said. Her tone was crisp but urgent, short, human, something that shows acknowledgement, even regret. "We could phrase it carefully, but you need to say something." Victoria scoffed. "Regret? For what? That woman looked like she didn't belong. That's not my fault." The room froze. Even Bradley stopped scrolling. Eleonora blinked once, slowly, her expression unchanged. "You just said that out loud, in front of your sons, while I'm sitting here trying to protect your legacy." Clinton stopped pacing. "Mom," he said, voice low, measured. "Derek walking away has already tanked investor confidence. You're hemorrhaging public trust. Do you even understand how bad this is?" Victoria didn't flinch. "He'll come back," she said flatly. "They always do. Pride fades when the money dries up." Eleonora closed her binder with a sharp snap. "You're not listening. This isn't just about money anymore. It's cultural." He struck a nerve. Bradley finally looked up. "People are calling him a hero, Mom. They're quoting his speech like it's scripture. They're stitching his mother's video. The internet doesn't move like this unless it feels something." Victoria waved a hand like she was swatting a fly. "The internet moves on. They'll forget by next week." Clinton turned to her, eyes hard. "No, they won't. You become the symbol of elitist racism in every podcast and headline out there. And you haven't even apologized." "I'm not apologizing for having standards," Victoria said. Her voice was steel, cold. Eleonora shook her head. "They are not just losing one deal. You're losing the entire family brand." Victoria leaned back, unfazed. "We've weathered worse." But the room knew different. The Hathaway name wasn't just taking hits. It was unraveling, not because of what she said, but because she refused to see that what she said had finally stopped being acceptable. And now, the walls she'd built weren't keeping the world out. They were keeping her trapped inside. Clinton folded his arms, his stance no longer that of cautious son, but of a man drawing a line. "Then we're done," he said flatly. "You've already cost us one deal. I'm not letting you cost us the family business." Victoria turned her gaze slowly toward him. "You're going to side with him?" she asked, her voice almost amused. Clinton didn't blink. "I'm siding with reality." The silence that followed was heavier than the ornate chandelier above them. For years, Victoria Hathaway had ruled by tone alone. A glance, a phrase, a well-timed silence. But that power was shifting, slipping like sand through her manicured fingers. Because outside, the world was changing, and not in a way she could ignore. Eventually, the Hathaway Group released a statement. It was everything Eleonora had warned against. Cold, calculated, sterile. The Hathaway Group regrets the recent miscommunication that led to the premature end of the merger. We continue to uphold values of inclusion and mutual respect. No apology, no responsibility. just legal speak and hollow phrasing. It landed with a thud. Social media ripped it to shreds. Commentators called it tone deaf. Employees leaked memos. And the public, they didn't just dismiss it, they mocked it. The damage was no longer speculative. It was now measurable. Derek didn't respond to the statement. He didn't need to. His silence had already become its own kind of speech. Calm, unwavering, and louder than anything Victoria could manufacture. Instead, he stayed the course. Meetings, hiring, planning. He visited Gloria every Sunday, same as always, bringing banana pudding from a bakery in Trenton and fresh-cut gardenias. The press wanted a counterattack, but Derek wasn't interested in sparring. He was building. Meanwhile, journalists were digging into his past, not to scandalize, but to understand. Photos emerged of a younger Derek delivering packages in a hoodie and scuff boots. A former teacher recalled how he used to stay after class to read business books borrowed from the library. One clip from an old podcast resurfaced. "I'm not trying to be in anyone's club. I'm trying to build my own house." That line became a mantra for a generation of young founders. And the more the Hathaways flailed, the more Derek stood still and somehow moved forward. Because when a house built on appearances starts to crack, it's not the loudest voice that wins. It's the one that doesn't need to shout at all. It started quietly, then built like a tide. Warehouse workers who'd never posted a selfie were uploading video clips from break rooms and truck bays. "You shook my hand the day I got hired," one said. "Didn't even know my name, but looked me in the eye." A junior analyst wrote a LinkedIn post about the time Derek stayed late on a Friday to walk her through a budget model she didn't understand. No cameras, no HR notice, just help. One of the security guards at HQ posted, "He brings me coffee when he's in early. Doesn't even drink it himself." These weren't PR plants. They weren't orchestrated testimonials. They were just people speaking up because, for once, someone had made them feel seen. Investors started weighing in too. Not all were pleased, but a surprising number were. One VC wrote, "Walked away from $1 billion to protect his name. That's someone I want in the boardroom." Another added, "We say we want founders with backbone. Then act surprised when they use it." The comments were raw, unscripted, and they spread fast. Suddenly, Derek wasn't just the CEO. He was a mirror, reflecting back the values people claimed to believe in, but rarely saw acted out at scale. And it was making waves even Derek hadn't anticipated. Meanwhile, his team kept working. No flashy statements. No major pivots. Just action. Nia led a rapid redesign of the company's brand narrative. Not to capitalize, but to clarify. "We're not in crisis," she said during the internal call. "We're in definition." Julian oversaw operations, keeping trucks on schedule, suppliers engaged. Elliot kept the financials clean, making sure the story stayed supported by substance. But even with the internal gears turning, it was Gloria who delivered the most powerful message yet. In a short interview with a morning show, she sat in a plain chair, wearing a soft blue blouse, hands folded neatly. Her tone was gentle, but unshaken. "I didn't ask for attention," she said, "but I raised my son to speak when silence costs too much." The host leaned in. "Do you think he should have signed the deal anyway?" Gloria smiled, small, sad, unmovable. "Some money comes with chains," she said, "and I'm too old to wear chains." That line hit like a thunderclap. It was quoted in newspapers, stitched into TikToks, printed on t-shirts, not because it was catchy, but because it was true, because it came from someone who had nothing to gain and everything to remember. In the days that followed, the impact deepened. Quietly, a few mid-sized firms began to distance themselves from the Hathaway Group. Some ended contracts early. Others paused negotiations without explanation. It wasn't loud, but it was real. Not because Derek asked them to, and not because of any official boycott, because people were starting to see what Victoria represented, and what Derek refused to. At a logistics summit in Chicago, a keynote speaker veered off script mid-presentation. "There's power in walking away," she said. We all watched someone do it, for reasons that had nothing to do with profit margins. The audience clapped, not wild applause. Something steadier, more grounded. Meanwhile, Derek stayed out of the spotlight. He wasn't posting. He wasn't making noise. He was building, meeting with teams, reviewing expansion strategies, preparing for the next phase, not just in business, but in belief, because something had shifted, and it wasn't going back. At headquarters, an intern caught him in the hallway and said, "You gave my dad hope again." Derek nodded, but didn't know what to say. Because what do you say when doing the right thing become the movement? You don't script it. You live it. Still, the storm hadn't passed. Not fully, and not everyone was on board. Some whispers inside the industry questioned Derek's temperament, said he'd gone too far, that walking away from merger over an insult was short-sighted, emotional, even dangerous. But those voices were starting to sound hollow, out of touch in a moment when the world was listening to something deeper. Because this wasn't about one man or one company anymore. It was about what kind of future people were willing to build, and what kind of dignity they were willing to sell to get there. Derek never addressed the critics directly, but when a local college invited him to speak on business ethics, he accepted, not because he wanted to talk, but because the next generation was already watching. During the Q&A, a student asked, "How do you know when to walk away?" Derek paused, looked across the sea of young faces, and said, "When staying costs you more than money." The room went quiet, not out of reverence, out of recognition, because some truths don't need echo. They just need to be spoken once, clearly, and without flinching. The envelope arrived like it didn't belong. Off-white, thin, no return address. Just Derek's name typed in the center. Neat, centered, almost too precise. It had been mixed in with the usual stack of vendor contracts and project summaries. He almost tossed it aside. Almost. Hours passed before he opened it. Late in the evening, when the office had emptied and the hum of the city outside had softened to a low murmur, inside was a letter, handwritten, cursive, neat but careful, like each loop had been practiced. "Mr. Samuels, you don't know me, but I know who you are. My father was the groundskeeper at Hathaway Ridge from 1985 until 2009. He raised me and my two sisters on that job. Woke up before the sun, never complained. Taught us to be proud, even when we were invisible. I saw your story on the news, and I cried. Not because I was surprised by what happened to your mother, because I wasn't, but because for once someone said no and meant it. You reminded me of my father. He never had your platform, but he had your spine. I just wanted you to know, not everyone forgets where they come from, or who they stand up for. With deep respect, Camille Pierce." Derek read it twice, then once more. He folded the letter slowly, like it meant more than paper, and in a way it did. That name, Camille Pierce, rang somewhere faint in his memory. He searched his inbox. Nothing. No LinkedIn. No Godona records. Just the letter. And somehow, that made it land even harder. Later that night, over dinner, he told Gloria. She said her father was the groundskeeper. He murmured, pushing greens around on his plate. Said I reminded her of him. Gloria looked thoughtful. "Funny how truth reaches you," she said. "Doesn't matter the route. It finds you." Derek nodded, but didn't say much else. He felt the weight of it settling in his chest. Not heavy with pain, but with meaning. This wasn't another headline. It wasn't another viral clip. It was someone who had lived behind the gates that now symbolized everything he refused to become. Someone who had carried invisibility with grace, and who now saw herself reflected in him. The next morning, Derek walked into the office early and handed the letter to Nia. "I want to find her," he said. "Camille Pierce." Nia raised a brow. "Should I call ahead?" "No," Derek said. "I just want to knock." 2 days later, Derek stood on a narrow stoop in Harrisburg, Pennsylvania, holding a paper bag from a local bakery and feeling something he rarely felt anymore: nervous. The building was modest, red brick, quiet, A screen door rattled gently in the breeze. He knocked twice. Camille opened the door wearing jeans and a school district sweatshirt, her brown hair pulled back in a simple ponytail. She froze, eyes wide. I'm Derek, he said, offering the bag. And this is banana bread. I figured you might be tired of people only wanting something from you. She blinked, then let out a small laugh. Come in before my dog tries to eat you. Inside, the apartment was warm, cluttered in a lived-in way. Framed photos, a throw blanket draped over the couch, a dog bowl near the kitchen, a black and white photo sat on the mantel, a man in boots standing under an oak tree, rake in hand. Derek moved toward it instinctively. Your father. Camille nodded. He worked that estate like it was his own. I know the type, Derek said softly. They sat. She made tea. And then they talked. Not about headlines or money, but about her father. The man who never raised his voice, but taught her the power of standing still when the world tried to move you aside. He'd have liked you, Camille said at one point. Not because you made it big, but because you knew when to walk away. They spoke for nearly 2 hours. No photos, no press. Just two people connected by a history neither of them had asked for, but both had carried. When Derek finally stood to leave, Camille handed him a worn photo. Her father beneath that same oak tree, rake in hand, eyes calm. For when the world gets loud again, she said. Derek took it like it was fragile, like it meant something he didn't have words for. On the drive back, he didn't turn on the radio. He let the silence sit beside him. Let's speak, because sometimes the most powerful reminders don't come from boardrooms or speeches. They come in ink and quiet homes and the shadows of old trees. And what that letter reminded him, what Camille reminded him, was that legacy isn't always loud. Sometimes it whispers. But if you're paying attention, it's enough to carry you through the next storm. It started with a voicemail. Calm, almost too calm. A nurse from Capital Care Medical Center in Trenton. Nothing urgent, she said. Your mother fainted briefly at Bible study. We brought her in just to be safe. Derek didn't wait. He was in the middle of a product review meeting when he stood up mid-sentence, grabbed his keys, and walked out. No explanation, no hesitation. He drove the turnpike with his jaw locked, barely blinking. When he arrived, Gloria was upright in her hospital bed, ginger ale in hand, looking mildly annoyed. I told them I just stood up too fast, she said, shaking her head. Didn't need all this fuss. But Derek saw the fatigue in her eyes, the slight tremble in her hand as she set down the cup. He pulled the chair close and sat, took her wrist gently in his hand. What did the doctors say? She shrugged. Then I need to slow down. Take my iron pills. Eat more greens. The same thing I've been telling you for years. Derek tried to smile, tried to meet her lightness, but the knot in his chest wouldn't ease. Not this time, not when it was her. A few minutes later, Dr. Mei Lin stepped in. Young, sharp, steady, but with the kind face of someone who understood what news sounded like in rooms like this. She spoke softly, but clearly. Your mother's vitals stabilized quickly. That's the good news. But we'd like to run one more test. Her blood pressure is fluctuating more than we'd like. It's been a while since she's had a full cardiac workup. Gloria waved it off. I feel fine. Derek didn't even blink. Run the test. Over the next 2 days, they stayed close. Derek cleared his schedule, set up shop in the hospital's quiet corner lounge. He took calls in whispers, stepped outside for strategy briefings, but never strayed too far. The results weren't catastrophic, but they weren't clean either. A leaky valve, mild arrhythmia, iron deficiency, the kind of things that didn't scream emergency, but whispered urgency. And those whispers were enough. That night, as they sat watching reruns of Sanford and Son in her hospital room, Gloria didn't look away from the screen when she said, You've done good, baby. Derek chuckled. Did you just call me baby in front of the nurse? I brought you into this world, she said. I get to call you baby. He smiled, but it didn't push the worry from his eyes. I'm not done yet. Gloria nodded. I know, but don't wait too long to live. The line landed harder than he expected. He looked at her, really looked, at the deep lines carved by years of sacrifice, at the eyes that had once scanned cleaning contracts and bus schedules, now watching sitcoms like nothing had changed. But everything had. Derek leaned forward. "I've been thinking," he said slowly, "about what you told me, about legacy, about not handing down silence." Gloria turned toward him, eyebrows raised slightly. "I want to start something," he continued. "A foundation for workers, drivers, warehouse crews, their families, health screenings, childcare, tuition stipends. Not just lip service, real support, action." Her brow softened. Derek went on, "I want to name it after you." Gloria looked down, blinking more than usual. "You don't need to do that." "I do," Derek said, "because you built me." There was no grand emotional outburst, no crescendo of tears, just a stillness between them, a silence that said everything. A few weeks later, the Gloria Initiative was announced. No red carpet, no press tour, just a website, a launch video, and 3 nonprofit partnerships to start. It wasn't a headline, it was a heartbeat, and in a world full of noise, it cut through like truth. At the first Community Day event, Derek stood beneath a white tent surrounded by folding tables, food trucks, face painters, and book drives. The parking lot buzzed with kids chasing balloons and workers holding plates piled high. There was no stage, no teleprompter, just people eating, laughing, showing up. Derek took the mic only briefly. "I turned down $900 million, he said. "Some people call me crazy, but this is worth more than any check." The crowd clapped, not thunderously, but warmly, the kind of applause that fills a space with gratitude instead of spectacle. As the sun dipped low and the lot slowly emptied, Derek stood still, taking it in. He thought of Camille's father, of Farron, of the Hathaway boardroom, of the look on Gloria's face as he helped her into that black SUV. Everything that had followed, every headline, every battle, every silence had led him here. But even as peace settled over him like a well-worn coat, he didn't know that the next message would come from a voice he hadn't heard in decades, one he thought he'd buried with his childhood, and it would shake something in him deeper than business ever could. It came as a voicemail, no warning, no caller ID, just a blinking red light on Derek's phone after a long day packed with meetings, interviews, and lukewarm coffee that barely kept him standing. He tapped the icon absent-mindedly as he stepped through his apartment door, expecting a follow-up from Julian or maybe a vendor pinging him late. But the moment the voice came through the speaker, he stopped moving. "Derek, it's Dwayne. Yeah, I wasn't sure you'd still have this number, but I heard about what you did, about the deal, about your mother, and I had to reach out." His uncle's voice was older now, slower, slightly raspy, like time had dragged sand across every word. Derek didn't breathe. Dwayne, his father's brother, the one who stood beside him at the casket, promising, "I got you," and then vanished the same night, was suddenly back. "I saw you on the news," the voice continued. "Your mama raised you right. No surprise there. I'm proud of you, and I'm sorry. For a lot. If you ever want to talk, this is my number now." Then a message clicked to a stop. No second take, no text, just silence. Derek stood in the doorway, key still in his hand, phone screen dimming to black. He hadn't heard that voice in decades, but now it was in the room with him, thick with memory, heavy with everything that never got said. He poured a glass of water and sat at the kitchen counter, listening to the message again, slower this time, as if maybe something new would reveal itself between the pauses. But it was still the same voice, older, gentler, and somehow unfinished. That night, sleep didn't come easily. His mind kept circling back to Dwayne, ribs wrapped in foil on the 4th of July, loud laughter over dominoes, grease-stained work gloves on the porch railing, and then nothing. Silence like a slammed door that stayed shut for 20 years. In the morning, Gloria called before he could even process what to do next. "I heard from Dwayne," she said, skipping any small talk. Derek stiffened. "He called you too?" "Left a message yesterday," she replied. "Same as he did with you, I'd bet." He was quiet for a beat. "I don't know what he wants." "Maybe nothing," she said, her voice level. "Maybe he's trying to make peace while he still has time." Derek looked out the window, the city just starting to stir. "I'm not sure I need peace with him." Ori didn't push. She never did, but her next words stayed with him long after the call ended. "Baby, sometimes peace ain't for them. It's for you." That line stuck. It followed him through his meetings, lingered in the elevator ride to the top floor, echoed in the silence of his office as he sat behind his desk with the lights off and the city glowing faintly beyond the glass. He played the voicemail one more time, and this time, the bitterness he expected to feel didn't come. What landed instead was something quieter, fatigue, maybe, or the realization that he'd been carrying something heavy for so long. He no longer knew where the weight ended and he began. Later that evening, after the team retreat wound down and the last of the interns had drifted toward the shuttle, Derek stood on the edge of the rooftop deck and finally pulled out his phone. He tapped the number Dwayne had left. 3 rings, then a click. "Derek," the voice asked, cautious but hopeful. "Yeah," he said simply. "It's me." There was a pause, long enough to feel like a breath. "You sound just like your father," Dwayne said. "I get that a lot." Neither of them said anything for a moment. Then Dwayne exhaled like he'd been holding something for years. "I'm not calling to explain away the silence. I was a coward. After your dad passed, I couldn't look at anything that reminded me of him. And you were a mirror." Derek didn't interrupt. He just let the words hang. "I left," Dwayne continued, "because it was easier than staying and failing you. I didn't think I could be enough after he was gone." His voice cracked thin, not dramatically, but just enough to break the edge. Derek's reply came low. "I didn't need you to succeed. I just needed you to stay." Another silence followed, this one different, not heavy with blame, but with a fragile kind of truth neither of them had dared touch until now. They talked for 15 more minutes. Not about business, not about what had been lost, but about memories, fishing trips, football games, the way Derek's father used to hum to himself while fixing things. And when they hung up, Derek didn't feel closure. Not exactly, but he felt lighter. At the next team gathering, he spoke plainly. "Forgiveness isn't approval," he said. "It's just refusing to let bitterness take up all your space." The room was quiet, reflective. Some nodded. A few just stared. But one young intern followed him out afterward, jogging to catch up. "Mr. Samuels," she said breathlessly, "I just wanted to say thank you. My dad always told me no one in business ever sticks to their morals, that it's always about money in the end. But you prove him wrong." Derek smiled. "No," he said gently, "my mother did." Weeks passed. The noise never fully faded, but it changed shape. Less outrage, more reflection. Derek returned to his routine, if it could still be called that. Mornings at the office, evenings checking in with teams, Sundays with Gloria, who was finally taking her pills without argument, though she still claimed ginger ale was better than water. The Gloria initiative was growing, quietly, steadily. The partnerships expanded to include free dental screenings and a pilot program for after-school care. No one shouted about it on social media. No press tour. Just people showing up and staying. But Derek felt something shifting inside him, something less visible than the headlines or quarterly reports. One night, as he stood in the middle of an empty operations floor, surrounded by conveyor belts and silence, he realized what it was. For years, he had been building a company. Now, he was building something else, a way of being, a standard that didn't require approval to be real. And for the first time in a long time, he didn't feel like he was chasing legacy. He felt like he was living it. He walked over to the wall and ran his fingers over the original warehouse blueprint, still framed from the Trenton days. It was faded now, but solid, like the foundation they'd built everything else on. The next morning, he gathered the executive team in the same glass-walled conference room where so many hard conversations had happened over the past few months. There was no agenda, no slideshow, Just coffee, tired eyes, and a strange kind of calm. Julian spoke first. "We've stabilized. That's the good news." Nia added, and the media noise. "It's helping more than hurting. 3 mid-sized logistics firms want a partner." Quietly but still. Derek nodded. "Because we stood for something." Nia gave a small smile. "Because you stood for something." He glanced at the dry erase board behind her, still marked with timelines and launch dates. "Now, don't want to sit on panels. Talk about leadership. Be the guy who said no to $1 billion and meant it." Julian chuckled. "You already are that guy." But Derek didn't smile. "Symbols are heavy," he said. "People worship them, or tear them down, and neither one feels like living." The room went quiet again. Then Nia said, "Then don't be a symbol. Be the standard." Derek looked at her, then nodded slowly. Maybe that was the answer. Not to carry the weight of a movement, but to make space for others to stand beside him. Not to preach values, but to practice them in full view. He stood and walked to the whiteboard, wiped it clean with one swipe, and began drawing something new. Not numbers, not markets. A layout, a block party, a stage, food trucks, children's tents. He turned around. "Next week, I want a real event. Not a press conference, not a gala. Something for the people who actually keep this place moving. Warehouse crew, interns, junior staff, their families. Food, music, joy. Not speeches, just presence." Julian raised an eyebrow. "A community day?" "No," Derek replied. "A family reunion. The kind where everyone gets a plate, no matter where they came from." Nia smiled wide, already picturing it. "You want this here, right in a parking lot," Derek said, "in full view of anyone watching." And a week later, that's exactly what happened. Long folding tables stretched beneath tents. Face painters kept kids laughing near bounce houses. Old warehouse radios played everything from Marvin Gaye to Outkast, and no one wore suits. Derek moved through the crowd like he always had. Head nods, handshakes, hugged where they made sense. When he finally stepped up to the mic, the crowd didn't hush from obligation. They listened because they wanted to. "I turned down $900 million, he said. "People said I was crazy. But this right here, this is what I call profit." The applause wasn't explosive. It was warm, steady, the kind that wrapped around you like something earned, not given. As the sun dipped low and the lights strung across the tents began to glow, Derek stood near the back of the lot with a plate of barbecue in one hand and a plastic cup of sweet tea in the other. He wasn't thinking about Hathaway, or stock prices, or redemption arcs. He was thinking about Camille's father, about old oak trees and handwritten letters, about his mother, sitting in a folding chair near the gardenias someone had brought for her table, laughing with a driver's wife over banana pudding, about Theron, who had shown up late but stayed long, and about Dwayne, who sent a short text that morning. "You did it right. I'm proud of you." As the crowd began to thin and the music softened, Derek looked up at the sky, clear, wide, and honest, and in that quiet, he felt the answer that had chased him for months. Legacy wasn't something you left behind. It was something you lived through, something you protected when no one was watching, something you passed on, not by wealth or title, but by example. And as long as he held on to that, he hadn't walked away from anything. He'd walked toward everything that mattered.